Unfortunately, Ambassador Vasquez fell ill and was unable to join us today. Get your flu shots, okay? Get your flu shots. Stepping in as moderator in his absence is Dr. David James Gonzales, Professor of History. Yes, let's hear it for Dr. David James Gonzales, Professor of History, Brigham Young University. Dr. David James Gonzales is a native of Southern California who began his collegiate studies at Southwestern Community College in Chula Vista, California. 2017, he completed the PhD in history at the University of Southern California, writing his dissertation on the Mexican-American struggle against segregation in Orange County, California, from 1920 to 1950. Currently, Dr. Gonzales is a professor of history at BYU and is also a producer and host of the podcast New Books in Latino Studies, part of the New Books Network, which streams on Apple Podcasts. He flew in this morning, thank you very much, all the way from Utah to join us today. So please give a very special welcome to Dr. Gonzales.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the OC Forum. Let's adjust a little bit. I have to thank Beverly Guzman first for giving me a call a couple weeks ago. I was on campus, and I see her number pop up, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I haven't seen her, talked to her in a few years, and she told me about this event. And so I should probably also thank my department, because they paid for the plane ticket. But yes, to the Moreno family, thank you also. Thank you for putting on this wonderful event, for honoring this important part of history. It's as probably many of you know or realize, the Mendez et al. Versus Westminster case is really virtually an unknown case, in particularly in American history, or even in our civil rights history. And I say that because I've spoken before a lot of audiences, particularly of academics, people that specialize in civil rights, people that specialize in the law, and oftentimes when I've spoken and mentioned Mendez et al., they just have blank, puzzled faces, and they have no idea what I'm talking about. And I'm like, oh, the Mexican version of Brown? Again, nada, right? Nothing. So it's known perhaps much more regionally, and maybe we take a bit of that for granted. But let me just set the stage a little bit, providing a little more of the historical context. As was mentioned, this case is a class action case, and there were 5 families. I want to read all of their names because, as we do in a lot of class action lawsuits, like Brown as well, we don't mention everyone else that was involved. So the plaintiff families, representing some 500 children throughout at least the defending districts, they are William and Virginia Guzman, Lorenzo and Josefina Ramirez, Frank and Irene Palomino, Thomas and Maria Luisa Estrada, and of course Gonzalo and Felicitas Mendez. Let's give those families a hand. Now, why this case? Why did Orange County need a desegregation case? Well, again, a misunderstood part of segregation and of that history in the United States, we think of segregation, we think of Jim Crow South, right? Maybe we even think of parts of the urban north, that become segregated as well. But we definitely don't think of Southern California, do we? No, we don't. But Orange County, back in the early 20th century, all the way up into a bit beyond this case, was a deeply segregated place. It was a place that was built that way, and it was built that way because of its dependence on big agriculture, particularly citrus agriculture. But unlike other seminal civil rights cases, Mendez et al., what really makes it unique is it resulted from grassroots community action. And what do I mean by that, right? I mean, there were no national organizations that came in and to help out, right? There was no one looking, there wasn't an NAACP in Southern California looking out for Mexicanos. There was the League of United Latin American Citizens, but that was mostly Texas-based. They did have California chapters, but this was not on their radar. And so when I say it was an organic grassroots community movement, it meant that these 5 plaintiffs' families, as well as others, like the Barrios family, the Tarango family, Veiga family, they created a social movement. They organized the community. They went around and decided that they were going to fight segregation. And I wish I had the document with me. One of the best examples of this is a petition that the families bring. This process starts way before 1945 when the case is filed. Even in 1919, when Santa Ana is planning to expand its number of segregated Mexican schools, Santa Ana was among the pioneers of segregating Mexican children in California, by the way. They started that in 1912. But as early as 1919, families were organizing and fighting. They were appearing towards the school board and protesting, right? They were ignored, and they continued to be ignored until Mendez. But that's what I mean by a truly organic leadership. Now, LULAC eventually is formed as a result of this Mendez case. Some of the key players and activists, again, like the Tarango, Barrios, Veiga family, and others, they formed the original LULAC 147 branch here in Santa Ana, or there in Santa Ana, right? But that comes after the case, right? And the NAACP then does get involved too. When it's first filed in federal district court, the NAACP starts paying attention. And later on, they do cite it as a test case. They said it's a test case. They didn't cite it as precedent in Brown because they couldn't. It was attacking segregation in a different way, right? But they were watching the case closely. They credited the case for pioneering some novel strategies in bringing expert social science testimony in order to show the harmful effects of discrimination, not just for the group that was being marginalized or segregated, but for all students involved. That's a little bit about the case. We'll hear a lot more, and it's going to be a lot more interesting from the families. I did want to say a few other things, and about that petition. That petition was signed by over 26 families, and there were a lot more than that was involved. There were dozens of families and activists in the community. They became activists. They weren't activists before this case, but they became activists as a result of getting involved in this case. And I view that document, which again I wish I had, as a kind of a declaration of independence, because the powers that be, they worked for the moneyed interest that was tied into citrus agriculture, that was tied into the banking system. It was running the economy, the local economy here. And to put your name on that document and to stand up against that was an incredibly brave act. And they did that together, again, with no support from any national organization. Just really quick, I'm going to touch on some of the legacy, which we'll talk more about, right? Because in some of these presentations, and it's true, I've heard others talk about, we still have a segregation problem in the United States today. That is true. Socioeconomically, there are parts of the United States are more segregated than they were even, right, in this classic era of civil rights. But that doesn't mean that progress hasn't been made, right? One of the key aims of this, right, was to try to get a sort of equality and equal treatment in education. Well, let's just look at California itself, right, in regards to education. As of 2017, according to the OC Department of Education, right, their high school graduation rate is 90.8%, right? Within that, for Latinos, it's 87.3%. So they're a few percentage points behind. But you want to try to guess what the high school graduation rate for Latinos or Hispanics was in 1945, in 1946, 1950, 1960? It was nowhere near that. We don't get to the graduation rates that we have today. We don't get to the Hispanic serving institutions like UC Irvine or 6 of the UC university systems, or more than 20 of the Cal State universities are Hispanic serving institutions, which means that they're at least 25%, most of them are well above that, Latino or Hispanic, but that they also have programming that they devote to serving that population. They're kind of like it's a similar designation to like the HBCU or something like that. But we don't get there. We don't get professors in the professorate that are Latino or Hispanic without cases, without the brave people like this. So I'll leave that for the framing of our discussion, and let me introduce our panelists. First, there is Harvey Javier Moreno. He's the owner of this beautiful restaurant, of course, which, as already mentioned, is celebrating its 50th anniversary. October 9th was the official opening day back in 1969. He's a native of El Medina, or as I learned to pronounce in oral histories and whatnot, Almadina. Not sure if that still flows, but he also attended segregated Hoover School during the 1940s. Beverly Guzman-Gallegos. Beverly is the daughter of William and Virginia Guzman of Santa Ana, who were co-plaintiffs in the Mendez class action lawsuit on behalf of their children who attended segregated Mexican schools in Santa Ana. Michael Ramirez. Mike is the son of Lorenzo and Josefina Ramirez of El Medina, who were also co-plaintiffs in the Mendez class action lawsuit on behalf of their children who also attended segregated schools in El Medina school district less than a few blocks from where we sit today. And Gustavo Arellano. He's a features writer for the LA Times and formerly editor of the OC Weekly. Gustavo is an award-winning journalist, lifelong resident of Orange County, and proud son of Mexican immigrants. I also want to recognize that we have other representatives from the et al. Families. Frank Palomino Jr. Where are you, Frank? There he is. Thank you. As a special guest, and we'll go with there. Transition to the panel. Is this one on too? Hello?
Hi.
Probably have to get these close. All right. Well, what we wanted to do is begin by asking you, Harvey, if you can recall for us some of what it was like attending schools prior to Mendez, either your own direct experiences or experiences that your family members recall.
I attended Lincoln School, first, second, third, up to the 4th grade. My experience, I couldn't speak English at all. So at that time, my mother had us transferred from the Lincoln School, which is right here in El Medina. We went to St. Joseph's in Santa Ana. And that's where I started speaking a little more English. But the surroundings around here, all I did was go to school, did a little bit of coloring, playing, and then I would come home and play marbles, fly kites, do a lot of activity right behind this block. That's where I grew up. That's where I was born. So my experience was, as far as the segregation that was going on, it didn't dawn on me that was going on until I used to get a haircut right across the street from here by the name of Steve Delmata, and he would talk to me as I was having my hair cut, and he was telling me about all the things that were going on in school, but I couldn't comprehend because I didn't understand what was going on. So that was my experience growing up here in El Medina.
Okay. Thank you for that. Mike, can you add as well some of what your family members? Yes. Thank you.
Well, luckily I went to the Lincoln School, but that was because it already integrated. Mm-hmm. So the older kids went from 6th grade up, went to the Roosevelt School. But you're talking about disparity. I have to bring up the story. You're talking about disparity of graduations and what happens to you and how you react. But my brother went to high school here, one of the few people that did make it to high school. And so my father asked him to go to see the counselor so he can maybe get college courses to get ready for college. Because very few people don't understand that school here ended at 8th grade. Going to high school was a privilege. So when he went to ask his counselors what courses he needed, his response to him was, don't worry about going to college. We have plenty of fruit and vegetables that need to be picked. So that was very discouraging. So he didn't last another year, and then he joined the Army. Right. So, but for me, I thought I was beyond the shadow. I didn't know that the elementary school that they built, Jordan Elementary, was actually to cover for the Mexican kids that went to the Lincoln School here. And of course, then they went ahead and tore that down to eliminate and erase that from El Medina.
Right. Right.
But I'm happy to be home. We lived right down the street from his store, La Morenita. Yeah, so always had to go to his store to get our groceries, and we were always mad, but we had to walk 5, 6 houses down to go to the grocery store. It was so far away. But other than that, no, it was. I enjoyed it. My older brother Jim, who went through that and did go to segregated school, I didn't realize how much it had affected him until now that we're older. I understand what he went through.
Right. Beverly, thank you. In your family, as you know, you grew up, and as maybe the case was talked about. I don't know. Can you tell us a little bit more of how the case, or even prior to the case, the experiences your family had, you know, with the segregated school system? Is that something that came up often?
Well, I can tell you what my mom went through, which she told me about, because she went to segregated schools. And it's basically like Mr. Moreno, right? He indicated, you know, that he would go to school and play and then come back home and play. That's what my mom said. She said that it was totally a waste of time for her because she'd go to school and everybody would go to school speaking Spanish, and then at school they'd be speaking Spanish, and then they didn't learn anything. All they did was like play with each other. And she says, what did I learn? It was just a waste of time. So when she came home, so basically she was like self-taught. Her and my dad were self-taught. And it's really, my father, his mother died at a young age. And so also my mother lost her father at a young age. So I guess those two combinations kind of brought them together. But she indicated, you know, that she wanted best, you know, for the family. She wanted my brother to have a better education than she did because she didn't want him to waste his time.
Right. Well, and what you mentioned there actually really comes out in the court records about not learning English. The whole basis of the segregation was supposed to be in regards to language instruction. It was actually promoted. And they use the cutting edge type of educational theories of the day about teaching assimilation and how you teach language. But what they actually found in the case was that the segregation was arbitrary. There was no type of exam or test that was ever given for these students, and that indeed the basis of their segregation became, do you look Mexican? Do you have a Mexican or Spanish last name? You know, if you couldn't pass for something other than Mexican, right, that became the basis of the segregation.
Correct. And in our case, my brothers only knew English because they went to non-segregated schools. So the problem with them is when my father brought them to El Medina to go into school, he was instructed that they went to the Mexican school and they didn't speak any Spanish. So now they would get beat up by the kids at school for not knowing Spanish. But then when the teachers heard the kids speaking Spanish, they'd go to the principal to get a swat. So they would literally swat the Spanish out of you. That's basically what they would do. So, and I have an example of a paddle hanging over there built for my brother's memory of what would happen to you if you spoke Spanish.
And Gustavo, you've written about this, I mean, perhaps locally, your columns in the OC Weekly are what, part of what revived the conversation of Mendez quite a bit. In your reporting and the people that you spoke to, what struck you the most as people recalled what it was like to live in Orange County when it was segregated like this? I mean, there were over 50 different barrios and colonias that were segregated. I mean, they were kept apart from other communities. And there are over 16, at least officially, that we've been able to record, segregated Mexican schools. So from your reporting and your accounts of speaking to people, how did they describe this?
Just that if you didn't live it, you didn't know it existed. And here in Orange County, this is what I always talk about. We like to live in this la-la land where everything's nice and wonderful and pretty. And when you talk about history like this, you're not supposed to talk about it because, well, why do you want to talk about the past? This is not even ancient history. My parents, my mom, she was an immigrant from Mexico, and she, in the 1960s, in Anaheim, mid-60s, they remember being beaten up by white kids just because they were Mexican, even though the funniest thing, all my, from my mom's side, they're all super white, so they're whiter than the white kids, and they still got beat up. You want to talk about counselors, 1994, when I entered Anaheim High as a freshman, I go to a counselor and I ask her, hey, I don't know anything about college, but I hear college is important. She's like, no, you should be in a trade like carpentry or whatnot. So I think the story that you hear from pioneers like this, people who had to deal with it, is just it's important to know. And the funny thing you hear about this, when a lot of what they remember, they do recall idyllic communities, barrios, very tight, very united in that. But then once it started to come to, okay, now we have to go into the bigger world at large, they came across barriers. They came across either de facto or de jure segregation, all because of the color of their skin. That's what it really boiled down to. Whether you were a citizen, and a lot of them were all American citizens, but it didn't matter. Because of the color of their skin or their ethnicity, somehow they were then considered by the vast majority of Orange County to be second class, and that's still where we're at today. Always will be.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. For Mike and Beverly.
One person applauded. It's okay. Don't worry about it.
Can the two of you tell us how your parents became directly involved and became, named as lead plaintiffs?
Well, my father actually had started the cause in 1938 by joining a benefit mutual club through the Catholic Church. So he knew, he was raised, he was actually a Mexican citizen. He's the only one that was a Mexican national in this lawsuit. But, so he always wanted to help people. And then in 42, in 39, his boss, he actually lived here and we moved to Murphy Ranch in 35. And so he got involved in the Bracero program. So he was in charge of that. And one of the articles in the Bracero program is the kids will be educated like everyone else. Mm-hmm. There's no segregation in there. It wasn't just a contract of wages. And in 43, he found his way to Ezequiel Padilla, who was the Attorney General of Mexico at the time, and he went to San Francisco for discrimination conferences, and that's how he got involved. And then once he came down here, we actually moved from Murphy Ranch in 44 and went to Gilroy. Again, they went to integrated schools. And when he came back, because our grandfather was very ill, he went and enrolled my brothers in the American school, and was told right there and then that no, that wasn't where they were going to go. We have plenty of room in the Mexican school, but not any in the American school. And so that is what got him involved. So he had already known about Marcus at an earlier time. Mm-hmm. So, and that's how he got involved.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I just really quickly, when he says Marcus, he means David Marcus, who was a lawyer who represented all the families and also just an incredibly unsung hero of civil rights in Southern California.
Very much so,
yeah,
yes.
Okay. Yeah, he represented hundreds, over his career, hundreds of cases representing Mexicans in immigration-type proceedings. He fought segregation 3 times in Orange County, once in Santa Barbara, Orange County. Is it twice? Did he represent? He didn't represent.
Dawson Burnell.
Dawson versus Burnell. So it's twice, right? That was
and San Bernardino.
Housing segregation.
Yeah,
case, right? So twice in Orange County and once in San Bernardino. Yeah. And these are all cases again. I mean, Mendez is 7 years before Brown, depending when you date it. 8 years before, actually 8 years before Brown with the appeal, even the Dawson versus Burnell case, which is outlawed. Restrictive race restrictive covenants, right, on housing deeds, and that happened something like. That was 5 years before Shelley versus Kramer, right? So I mean, these are pioneering cases that become enshrined in our Supreme Court law, constitutional law, and a lot of them had roots here. Beverly, your family. I mean, how did they get involved? and decide, actually start to make that decision that, they're pushing back, I know, and a lot of times there's arguing with attendance clerks. In fact, women, this is an important thing to say, right, most of the times it's women that are first confronting this segregation as they're trying to enroll their children into school. They're the ones that are first, pushing back on the fact that their kids are being denied entrance into these schools, right? Can you tell us a bit more about your family and how they get involved here?
Well, we got involved because, my mother went to go enroll my brother, William, at Franklin Elementary, and he was turned away. And they said that he needed to go to the Mexican school. So, and then my dad at the time was working in Long Beach at the Consolidated Aircraft. And so when he came home and my mom started telling him about it, well, of course, my dad had a very short fuse. Said all these words in Spanish. And then he went over and he confronted the lady at the principal at Franklin, and she told him, "I'm sorry, but there's nothing that I can do. You need to go talk to someone at the school board." So he went over to the school board in Santa Ana, and at the time, he raised a ruckus over there and told them, that how come all these other children were going to Franklin and how come my brother was being denied. And then he said, "Well, there's nothing we can do about it, Mr. Guzman." "Well, we'll see about that." So then he met an attorney there by the name of Charles Martin, and my dad asked him, "Would you represent me?" And so he said, "Yeah, I'll represent you." "Okay, so will you go in front of the school board and talk to them and ask them why my son cannot attend Franklin?" So yeah, so my dad negotiated with him, and he said, "Yeah, okay, you're my attorney." So then when it came, well, right before the meeting, since my dad caused such a ruckus over there, they sent out letters to all the kids that were already going to Franklin. There was already a few Latinos that were going to Franklin. And so these parents also got letters indicating to them that they no longer were allowed to have their children attend Franklin. So then by that time, everybody was with pitchforks, saying, "Hey, we're going to this meeting too." Then the word got around in the neighborhood, we all have to go to this meeting. So everybody showed up at the meeting. And at that time in the meeting, everybody was talking, why is this going on? Why can't my son? What's going on with these letters? And then, so after that, they told us, my dad approached the attorney and he says, "Well, what's going to happen?" And then he said, "Well, I spoke to them and they said that Billy would be allowed to go to Franklin." And then my dad said, "Well, what about the other kids?" And then, "Well, if you don't say anything, then Billy will be allowed to go." And my dad said, "Well, how can I do that? They're my neighbors, they're my friends. How am I going to keep that from them?" So he said, "You know what I'm going to do? Billy's going to stay home from school until St. Anne's is built. Then he's going to go to a parochial school." So that's how my dad decided to solve it. But it's come up, in the past few years that my dad didn't win the case, and that, even though he got the attorney. But my dad was an inspiration to all the other families, that they needed to come forward, that he would also come forward again, and that's what he did. And that's...
One thing I appreciate you mentioning is there are several ways that Mexican-American families resisted segregation. Sometimes it was choosing not to send their kids to school, as painful as that was. Sometimes for those that had the means or could gather the means, it was to send them to a private school. Or some tried to move to another part of Orange County where, they had facilities and they hadn't built segregated schools, and they tried various ways to get around this. And for some of them, it was just, a terrible option, and they had to send their kids. Right, so that's usually oftentimes that's not recognized when we look at what people do on their own to fight. We usually pay attention to these court cases, which are very important, but again, this struggle existed, decades before, and all these little types of choices that were made to how to deal with, some bad options, right? For the whole panel, I was wondering because what came to my mind as you're talking to both of your families is where does the community start organizing? Like, where do they get together, right? Because nowadays you can use schools, but you're not going to go to the segregated school and like start a meeting like to tear down segregation. So we know that several organizations are formed. The Latin American Voters League by Hector Tarango and Cruz Barrios and others, and then you have the Westminster Fathers Association forms. And so, where are they meeting? Where are they having these conversations? This is to all of you that want to talk. Harvey, do you have a?
I don't have an idea.
Well, usually at somebody's house. A lot of it was at the church. La Purísima Church is where they had a lot of them. Here we had a Sanchez Hall, which is no longer there, but they had the meetings after work in dark. As a matter of fact, no one was allowed to come to our house. My father had all his meetings away from the home because of worried about reprisals, I'm sure.
Right.
But all I knew was, where's Dad? He's at a meeting. But my father belonged to several. He was the president of El Latin American League.
Right.
But he also belonged to the Progresista Mexicana, which doesn't right now get a lot of attention because some think that it was just made it was actually a progressive Mexican society. But if you read their motto, it's for respect, boy, now I forgot it.
It was like patriotism, education was in there.
Education, patriotism, respect. So, and their motto, if you read it, you can read their wanting to be accepted in their motto. It's just unbelievable. It breaks your heart. And one of the passages it says, we will fight this not against each other, but together for the betterment of this cause. So to think that they were just a society that didn't mean anything.
Right.
Is something I think that needs to be explored more.
Well, you're right, because oftentimes they say that those are just cultural, like organizations that they created celebrations, but Progresista actually was born out of another organization that came out of San Bernardino who organized because this group of men were walking to town and they found a dead Mexican male on the street that had been lying there for days. And they organized because they realized that the city, that those that could have done something about it had refused to do it. So, I mean, civil rights, right, justice, social justice was always at the center of these organizations, even though you're right, they don't get that credit initially.
Correct. And that's where the Progresista was born. It was actually the Zaragoza Society.
Yes, Zaragoza Society, that's right.
So, yes, it's unbelievable how these, but it was a fraternal order, and some people say it was just a burial insurance. They went out and collected burial insurance, but it was more than that. It has in their passages about civil rights and standing united, things like that.
Beverly, did you ever hear anything about where these meetings were going on or how people were getting together?
Well, for my family, it started at the kitchen table, and then from there I went to the school, and then, of course, my dad worked at Villegas Mortuary, where Mr. Villegas and, of course, Ariana's grandfather worked there. He didn't work there, but he was one of the leaders that would come and meet there. And my dad was working for Villegas Mortuary, so right after work, they would gather, and a lot of the Latino leaders would come, and they would discuss the issues that were happening in the city at the time. And I'm sure, like, they would discuss maybe Almadena, Garden Grove, and, not only school issues. I'm sure there was different issues that were spoken about. But that's where they really got together, and that's where they really got fired up, and that's where they said, hey, this person's having this problem, you're having this problem, you're having the same problem. So let's unite. Let's see what we can do. Let's see how we can raise money to help these families. And I think that's how it got started in Santa Ana. And here we are today discussing this, but we're still having issues, and I guess it's never going to end. And my dad always said, be vigilant, keep your ears open, and don't lose sight of what's going on in your community, because what happened today or what happened to your brother can happen again.
Gustavo, you got something to add? Anything that you've from?
Just, I would say historically, the places where these organizations would meet would be church halls, would be houses. It would also be restaurants
Yep.
as well. In my research, I never found like what would have been like the gathering place for Mexicanos or Latinos to plan civil rights issues in Orange County. But I know in San Bernardino, the big place was Meat La Cafe. Meat La Cafe is the oldest Mexican. It's the oldest Mexican restaurant in the Inland Empire. It's been open since 1937. Also, for trivia's sake, that's where Glenn Bell of Taco Bell fame ripped off their tacos to create Taco Bell. Absolutely true story. But and
Read his book.
yeah, it's in my book. But but more importantly, like Meat La Cafe, and it's still there. It's a great old school restaurant on the old Route 66, Mount Vernon. And it's still in the hands of the family, and they're also very proud that Cesar Chavez, whenever you go to the Inland Empire, that's where they would have their meetings. They were having meetings there from the 40s and 50s. And I also think one of the important things to realize about, especially during the desegregation era, is that a lot of the people who were doing these organizing, or the organizing, there were middle-class Latinos, and there were also a lot of entrepreneurs. A lot of entrepreneurs coming in, giving their money, giving their time, opening up their business, because they knew that it's not just about what I got for my family, it matters everyone. Like, William Guzman saying like, yeah, okay, I could have gotten this for my son Billy, but it's not about my son, it's about the principle. Right. And even though like I'm taking him to a Catholic school, if my family or my cause or my help is ever needed again, I'm gonna step up and do that. And I just can't overemphasize how selfless these families were in sort of setting aside their egos to do the collective good and pushing for. Again, it was 5,000 children. Like you see it there on the lawsuit for Mendez on the very front page, on behalf of more than 5,000 children. That to me is just so amazing to remember that.
Well, and so many of them, the families, they worked for people that would have put them at threat, right? I mean, whether they worked in in agriculture or not. Again, I mean, the money in Orange County was tied to agriculture. It was tied to oil too. But you look at the old, county board of supervisors, records and notes, and these people are interconnected. And so my next question was the risk. I mean, the risk that your families took. Do you have recollections of that? There was conversations about that, because I know that there had to have been people that said in the community that said, you know what, don't make too much noise, right? This is people are going to lose jobs, people could lose businesses, right? I mean, it's not too far from the citrus strikes, where the OC sheriff, basically called like open rebellion, open arms against orange pickers, right? Shoot to kill order that was in the San Juan Register right at the time. So I mean, it's not too far removed from those type of experiences.
Well, they actually brought football players with bats in their hands from USC to Orange, actually, to stop the strikes. It isn't funny, but that's where they came from. USC and UCLA played a big part in both sides. But what irked my father is he went to school with the ranchers' kids. So by the time my father came back with his kids, he was actually speaking to Mr. Campbell, who my brother Larry worked for. And that's what got him so upset. And my mother said she had never seen him so upset. And he said, I will not live on my knees in front of white America. He just could not believe that these were the same guys that I played in the schoolyard with that are promoting this same thought of discrimination. And that's actually what got his anger.
Beverly or Harvey, were there things that you heard as your family maybe might have talked about this, of just what was at risk by standing up, by speaking out?
I forgot to mention that during the time that I was attending grammar school, I went from first to the fourth grade, but during the second grade, I was kept twice because of my English. And another thing that comes to my mind is that the fact that I was used to go get supply from the Lincoln School to the Roosevelt, and they chose me. I don't know whether it was because of my complexion, my eyes, but I was chosen to go get the supply just across the field and back and forth. But I think that was the reason that there was going on. So,
Great, thank you.
Okay, for me, I mean, it doesn't surprise me because of my dad's personality. He was pretty outspoken, and I don't know if any of you have people in your family that are very outspoken. You go somewhere and they say something like, oh, you know, let's leave. Well, that was my dad. You know, he was very outspoken. He didn't care what anybody said. He was going to get, you know, his word across. So that was him. So it doesn't surprise me that he turned out to be a leader, you know, for the cause of the, you know, Mendez et al. Versus Westminster. But people don't realize that back in the day that Santa Ana was the county seat, and it was also the headquarters for the KKK. So you had a lot of, that's why a lot of they would meet in private. So I mean, meeting at the mortuary was just like perfect, you know, because who would think to look for a meeting at the mortuary, right? And so that's, you know, I give kudos for all these men that chose this particular, you know, facility and business to have their meetings. But yeah, it was pretty, you know, there was communism. Don't forget that it was during World War II too. So, you know, people, you know, if you did anything, you know, out of the ordinary, you were labeled a communist. So, so, you know, these fathers, you know, they didn't care. You know, Mr. Ramirez, Estrada, Palomino, Mendez, you know, they were very strong figures and very, you know, fathers. They were bold. They wanted to speak up for their family and for their children.
You know, you mentioned communism. That's not a joke. There was FBI files on people that were involved with Mendez. Some of the activists, like Hector Tarango, who is associated with Fred Ross, who is an activist with other things. But I mean, they were watching. They were indeed keeping tags on them. They're using the local authorities to do that as well.
So David, I'm sorry, David, did you hear that Rod Steiger was also involved? Yeah.
We want to turn now to get some questions from the audience. So we have a microphone.
Maybe you could share how segregation impacted your families outside of school and outside your community that you lived in. So such as public parks, pools, theaters, etc.
Well, our public pool was right here on Glasell. And we had Hart Park, correct. And we had Mexican Mondays, which we were only allowed to go swimming one day a week. And at the end of our day, they would drain the pool, clean it, and then open it up the next day. So we also had two theaters. One's now a church, which is across the street from Chapman University. Yeah. And that was also segregated. We were only allowed to use the balcony in that, and I can't remember the name of that theater at the time.
The Sunlight. It's now the Sunlight Christian Church, but I
Right.
don't know what the original name.
It was called the Orange Theater. There
Orange
they go.
Theater.
And then the other one was Western, I believe, and that was just one. That was one floor, so we had to sit in the back or use that very littly. Couldn't allow to even go there.
That's the West Coast in Santa Ana.
West Coast?
Yeah. In Santa Ana, West Coast.
Thank you very much. So, yeah, it did impact your everyday. We would go to Santa Ana and go to the Woolworth and get our hamburger. And unbeknownst to us, our dad would, since we had 11 kids in our family, he would shuttle us outside and we'd actually eat on the curb. We didn't know at that time that we weren't allowed to sit and eat our hamburger there on. So did it impact you? Yeah. Did our father have a way to get around it? Yes. I always have a joke. It's, you don't call it, we're Mexicans, not Mexicans.
And for those of you who are interested, when you walked in the front table, there is a walking guide for the city of Orange with all the sites in Orange. So I just happened to find that when we were preparing for this. So please feel free to take that, and it lists all these sites that we're talking about today. And next question.
Yeah, my question is, you know, first of all, I wanted to share my gratitude on behalf of, I'm sure, everybody here for your sacrifice and for the pioneering legacy that you're leaving for all of us. And that leads to my question is, what advice do you have for the next generation of folks that are impacted by either overt or covert discrimination? What strategies, tools, tactics do you recommend from your experiences that could make a difference to making Orange County and the United States a better place to live?
I would say doing what we're doing today is the best experience. Because you see, we feel like we were just here. We didn't have the kids growing up, I work at a high school, and they feel there really isn't a purpose. When I went to high school, we had Mecha League just started. What were we going to study? Pancho Villa, Zapata. That wasn't what, I couldn't identify anybody there. Cesar Chavez was just a pain in the rear to the ranchers, and then Martin Luther King, except for the color barrier, what did that have to do with our culture? Nothing. So we always felt like we rode on the shirt tails of people. So what we're doing today is great. And I think our personal experiences is probably the best teacher, best lesson.
And I think fear is what holds people back. And I heard someone mention that they just found out that someone in their family went to a segregated school, but then never spoke about it. Well, I believe that they didn't speak about it because they were ashamed to speak about it. And not everybody was ashamed. I mean, some people felt that's just the way of life. That's just the way it was. Because I asked my mom, well, how did you feel, because she told me, I asked her, Mom, I go, what kind of toys did you have growing up? She says, I had one skate. Or one skate. She goes, yeah, I used to tie it on with a rag and pretend like I was skating with two skates and just go in circles. And I go, that's terrible. And then she said, well, nobody knew any different because everybody was in the same situation. So she said, the one thing that would hold people back is fear, intimidation. And if you're not afraid to stand up for what you believe in, then that's half of the battle there. But if you're afraid, you're never going to be able to accomplish anything. For myself, I was afraid, to be here, like in front of you people when I first started, and I had to overcome that fear because it's not easy when you've never done it before. So you got to put a little fire in your belly and just kind of stand up and say, I can do it, I can do it, and just do it.
I was just wondering, prior to Brown versus the Board of Education, I believe the standard was separate but equal on segregated schools, or that's what was used to justify the approach. What was the attitude of the institutions and the civic backbone of Orange County, the power structure of Orange County? Did anyone even acknowledge that standard and that it was obviously falling short, or was it just was this just silence other than in the communities themselves?
They did when it went to court, is when they decided that they figured they had to in some way come up with an explanation for why this was. Now, I mean, I don't want to be, act like this was completely like insidious or anything, but I mean, racism is, and some of it, the key is we have to understand too about this period, it doesn't excuse it, but science itself was racist. The pedagogical theory of the day, right, was racist, and it's what provided justification. I mean, they didn't follow, the key is where we know that was hollow, is they didn't follow any type of standard of measurement to try to, test whether or not a student actually needed to be segregated or not into language classes, and nor was there any type of curriculum that was really standardized, to try to resolve that issue. I mean, that's what becomes blatantly apparent in the court documents and the transcripts. And as much as brave as the families were, there's something like 12 or 14, I think, adults that testify in Mendez and 2 children that testify. With as compelling as their testimony was, what I think actually got the case in their favor is that the superintendents were incredibly racist. And when they got up on the stand, They talked about how being Mexican was a cultural, and even like a racial like detriment, and that they needed to be segregated because they needed to be kept apart from white kids so as not to like influence them, but also because they needed to be, taught how to bathe, they need to be taught how to, act appropriately. I mean, this stuff was just coming out of their mouths, and it's all over the transcripts. So it's why we know that, despite the fact that there was, pedagogical justification and other scientific, theories that were racist at the time that they could have used, their own testimonies, right, condemned them. That is the superintendents, right.
And actually, if I could just add to that, actually the Mexican school, the Lincoln School, at that year had actually scored higher on test scores than the white school. And Carol Torres, who is from El Medina, who my father took to the court case, answered every question beautifully in perfect English. So that was another step that they had, hurdle that they had to try to climb over.
And it's tough because not too many of these schools looked exactly or functioned exactly similar. Again, that's where there was like a lack of standardization. In some, they were literally teaching like manual arts. In some, they had some type of basic arithmetic and language studies, but it was just, it was all over the place.
And one of their arguments is, we didn't know the nursery rhymes.
Test. Is it on? Okay. I just wanted to say thank you for being here. I'm actually a product of the Bracero program. My dad, who passed away from cancer 5 years ago, told me many great stories of how many actual white people and Asian people helped my father while he slept in trains coming back from Guadalajara, Mexico. He talked about how they would fumigate him before he went back. When he would come back from Mexico, they would fumigate him in the trains to clean him up before they went to work in the U.S. But what is your opinion about? I mean, I try to pass this on to my son, but what is your opinion as far as education so our kids can learn more about what is the Bracero program? What was World War II and the Bracero program? Because unless you go to a university, you're never going to learn about Chicano studies and the Bracero program.
This is where I think it's so important to have ethnic studies in schools, in high schools especially, because its detractors try to say, oh, well, why are you trying to separate it from American history? This is a thing, ethnic studies is American history, but how telling that academics and activists 40, 50 years ago at this point said, you know what, you're not telling our stories, so we're just gonna create our own departments and tell our stories. These are all American stories. This is all American history having to involve Americans of Mexican descent. So the most important thing is to get those stories out there. I mean, history is so bad that in the 1970s, one of the Mendez daughters, she went to, I think it was UC Irvine, wherever she was going to school, and she read a book called North from Mexico by Carrie McWilliams, which was published in 1948. And he mentions the Mendez et al. Case. She had never even heard of it. She's from the Mendez family. She goes to her parents and says, how come I never heard of this case, not in high school or whatever? And you're slowly starting to see it in the high schools in Orange County, but not nearly enough. So we just need as much of this education as possible. Again, this is all American history. This is not radical history. This is not skewed history. This is not fake history. It's history. So why do so many people have a problem with hearing it? Because it's an ugly truth. But I would also argue that, look, there's heroes in this. Yes. Americans love heroes, so why don't we learn about our heroes?
Yeah. By the way, there's also a brand new...
Thank you.
A brand new monument to the Bracero program that's in downtown Los Angeles. I think it's near the plaza. And it was just unveiled. I mean, I think it's things like that, right? We have monuments for all sorts of stuff around this country. I mean, how wonderful is it that we now have a monument to recognize all those people that are here and what they've contributed to this country? Because indeed, it is American history.
Yeah, and really quickly, like Lorenzo Ramirez, the library at San Diego Canyon College is named after him, and there's a bust after him. But all the families, the Guzmans, the Palominos, the Estradas, they should all have monuments here in Orange County. This is our history. This is our history.
I have a question for Mike Ramirez.
Yes.
Michael, a lot of people in this room probably are not aware of the segregated schools that were here in Al Medina. You want to let everybody know how close it is from here to where the segregated schools were?
You're actually 2 blocks away.
2 blocks away.
You just take Chapman, you cross Park, you go to Hughes now, but back then it was called Alameda. And right where the, what's the name
La
of it?
Carreta.
La Carreta is, that used to be the Roosevelt
Oh,
side.
wow.
And the one by the street was called Lincoln. So you are right down the street from the two segregated schools. And I may add to your bracero program, is my father was picked by Murphy Ranch in Whittier, and he would go to LA to go get the braceros. So his heart was still in Jalisco and Guadalajara, because that's where he came from. So I think that's why he joined a lot of the clubs that he did that were on the Mexican side that we don't hardly hear from.
We have 2 more questions for you.
Okay.
My name is Joseph Morales. Just wanted to commend you for, I'm from UCI, for your sharing. My mom's parents went to segregated schools in Arizona. My mom was hit for speaking Spanish as a child in California. My dad flunked kindergarten because he couldn't speak English. Somehow his cousin passed, but my dad says I caught up to him in 1st grade because he flunked that. And he went to Mexican Mondays swimming in Fresno. And my grandfather was fumigated. And my tío was a bracero. I mean, I'm just sharing this because these are all things that they were ashamed to say.
Yes.
And so I want to commend you for sharing this. And I think it's empowering, I think, because I've always thought that there weren't as many people who had all these thoughts.
Well, thank you.
Can I say something? I just want to say that I'm really inspired by all of you guys that are here today. You know, all of you that have all these degrees and have come from households like this gentleman was just talking about. You guys are heroes. You guys are our legacy. I mean, our parents took that first step, but look at you guys. You guys are there, and you guys are going to keep, you know, your family and other people are going to come after you and do greater and, you know, bigger things. So thank you. I mean, pat you guys on the shoulder. Look at you guys.
I asked to be able to have just one more minute because I want to share that there are actually a lot of heroes from this area. My grandfather grew up in El Medina and went to these schools. I have this photo. He was the first person that he ever knew of to go to high school. He told me that in this school, boys were taught to be handymen and girls were taught to clean so that they could go on and serve other people. He picked every crop from here to Seal Beach.
Yep.
He somehow went to Santa Ana College, became president there, and then went to UCLA, got his bachelor's degree, and then went to USC, got his master's degree in sociology so he could use that tools of the day to argue against racial inferiority of Mexicans. And then he began what, as far as I know, as a historian, was the first scholarship foundation for Mexican Americans in Pasadena.
Oh, wow.
So there's all these stories out here that people don't know, and I feel like he's here today, and I thank you for sharing.
What's your father's name? Please say his name.
My grandfather, Stephen Reyes.
Stephen Reyes. Yes, Steve Reyes. Yes, he's part of the Mexican American movement.
Yes, that's
Yes,
right.
yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to give it back to Paul. Thank you to all our panelists. Final hand.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
What a great conversation. Another hand for the panel. You guys were fearless. You were amazing. And we can't thank you enough. Terrific job. So let us indulge me just 1 second here. We need to also thank Ariana Barrios and her father for being here today. Ariana, thank you for putting on this wonderful program today. Thank you. Now, before we conclude today's program, I would also like to thank each and every one of you for being here today, and we hope that you will continue the conversation with us here at the Orange County Forum. Next up, get this on your calendar, Friday, October 25th, Census 2020. Who counts? and why it matters. This is a breakfast program at the Pacific Club, October 25th. We hope you can come. Also, keep your calendars open in December for our annual Housing Outlook program. A little later than usual, but we're going to do it. And if you haven't already done this, please follow us on social media to stay up to date with all things OC Forum. Again, thank you all for being here. Amazing program. Thank these people again. Great job, everybody. Have a great OC day.